So I first met Bree, my wife, in 2009 when we were working at a Starbucks.
Hi.
I came in for my first shift and I plopped myself down on a chair and I didn't have to clock in for a few minutes, and so I started reading a book. And all of a sudden, this really pretty girl in a green apron comes over and introduces herself. And in the coming moments, we would start flirting at work, and then we'd start talking on Facebook Messenger, and then we started hanging out at night and talking, and eventually we started dating. And at the time I was living in Mississauga, which really is not that much different than London in terms of its like suburbanness. And Bree was living in Brampton, which she had her own apartment, and it was pretty much the same thing as Mississauga in terms of like the feel of the city. There were lots of houses and lots of strip malls and lots of fast food restaurants. And so this is where Bree and I would start hanging out most of the time. But then when we made the decision to start dating officially almost 7 months later, it was finally time to meet her parents, which was a daunting task. We got in the car and headed up north of Mississauga, about a 45-minute drive away, and I realized that we weren't in the suburbs anymore. There were farms around, there were fields, and I realized we were in the country. Even though Bree was living in Brampton, that's not where she was from. She was a good country girl from a town called Hillsburg, Ontario. They had one stoplight, a small grocery store, a hardware store, and a couple other little shops. But there really wasn't much to this little teeny tiny town in terms of what we knew in Mississauga and Brampton. When we pulled into her parents' driveway, I looked up and saw this beautiful old farmhouse built in 1887. And there were still houses around, but these houses were all spread out nicely, which was really different than my house in Mississauga, where all the houses were only 10 feet away from each other. And when we entered her parents' house, it was so nice and toasty because they had a wood burning stove, which I had experienced before, but only in my grandparents' cabin in Newfoundland. But they had this in their home. As I spent more time in Bree's family home, the more I learned about her. I learned about her high school, and I learned that it was in the same building as a movie theater and a hockey rink and a library and a daycare and a senior center and these tennis courts and a community center. It was all in one. And I learned about the guys in her high school and how they got to school on their riding lawnmowers. And I learned that her dad, like most of the guys in her town, was an avid hunter, and he owned quads and snowmobiles. But I also learned that her family loved hospitality. They loved having people in that old farmhouse, and they loved hosting people all the time. I had gotten to know Bree when we first started dating, but when I entered into her home for the first time, it opened up parts of her story that I hadn't expected. I thought that I knew her, but I had just seen a glimpse of her story. We often assume we know the stories of other people. We assume we know them because we know their names or what they're good at or what they're into. And many of us confuse following someone on Instagram as actually knowing their story. But the truth is, their Instagram story is not their personal story. I made that mistake with Bree. I thought I knew her because we spent a lot of time together, but to be honest, I was missing a huge part of her story. We're all guilty of assuming that we know where our friends live, but until we step into their homes, there are pieces of them that we might not ever know. There's so much more to a person than what we see on the outside. Everyone has a backstory that we might not ever know about. And we also have a backstory. Each one of us has a story that comes with family dynamics and friends and things that have happened to us and hurts and wounds that we all carry. And there are good things and there are bad things all intertwined into the story of our lives. Most of us know our own stories pretty well. In those moments where you might break down and cry or lash out at a friend in anger, we look for people to understand our stories better in hopes that they can understand us. We say things like, if only they knew what kind of morning I had, or they don't know what we're dealing with at home, or I couldn't sleep last night because I was so worried and so anxious, or I'm angry all the time and I'm not even sure why it is that I'm angry. That might be true for us, but we forget to think about that step in moments when our friends lash out in anger or a family member is rude to us. We immediately get upset with them, but we rarely take a moment to take a step back and wonder why it is that they might have snapped at us. We've all had those mornings. The mornings where you oversleep and then you spill stuff all over your clothes and then you still miss the bus to school. And when our day starts like that, we become victims of our own emotions. Giving grace to our friends and our family in these moments is so important because the reality is we never know what they're facing. We rarely try to understand their backstory, and because of that, we miss out on being personal with them and knowing the story of who they are. Over and over in the New Testament, we see Jesus take time to get to understand the people that he met. He took time to have conversations and share meals with people that no one else would spend time with. Jesus looked for the opportunities to get personal with people. So we've been talking about this guy named Zacchaeus and how Jesus walked into his life. And Zacchaeus was not exempt to how Jesus impacted the lives of people that he interacted with. So we're going to jump into the Bible tonight, and I want you to think about what Jesus does to try and get to know Zacchaeus. So we're going to be in Luke chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. It says this: When Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. Zacchaeus, he said, "Quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today." Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. Jesus invited himself into Zacchaeus' home and took time to enter Zacchaeus' everyday context. Jesus knew it was risky, but he also knew that there was more to Zacchaeus than everyone in town thought they understood about him. In verse 19, at the end of verse 6, it says, "But the people were displeased. He had gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner," he grumbled. It clearly didn't go over well with some of the people in the town. They were all talking about it. But the thing about Jesus is that he didn't conform to the world's standards. He was looking for a way to connect with Zacchaeus on a greater level, and Jesus didn't care what the townspeople were saying about him. He wanted to step into the place that Zacchaeus was most comfortable, his home. Your space, your home, that's where you let your guard down. It's the place that Jesus knew that he could get closer to Zacchaeus and learn more about the man that Zacchaeus was. Where we live is more than our physical address. Understanding our circumstances and situations is the window into who we truly are. There's a part of our story that not everyone gets invited into, but here's the thing. Jesus is God. He already knew Zacchaeus' backstory, but Jesus spending time in Zacchaeus' home makes it all more personal and sets the example for us today. He was able to connect with Zacchaeus in a way that the crowd just wasn't willing to. Jesus showed that he wanted to get to know Zacchaeus in a really big way and to really understand him, and he did it by getting personal and showing up where Zacchaeus lived. When it comes to our understanding of our own stories and the stories of other people, we can look at the life of Jesus as he sought out ways to get personal with people and to understand their stories. Take a look at these verses in Philippians 2, verses 5 to 8. It says this: "You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges, he took the humble position of a slave, and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on the cross." Jesus stepped into our world as a human. He walked to the earth to step into our story and to experience the world that we live in. Jesus made God personal for us. When we read the story of Jesus, we forget the moments that allow Jesus to understand and connect with our own stories. The same exact moments from your story may not have happened to Jesus, but we can't forget that as a human, he was a baby and cried all night, went to the bathroom, just like Lake does upstairs right now. Jesus had to deal with siblings like many of you do, and maybe some of you have had to experience losses, and Jesus experienced the loss of his best friend. Jesus also questioned his purpose and dealt with people ridiculing him and doubting him. He knows your story. He knows the hurts you carry and the worry that you have. He knows the doubts that you have in him and the things that keep you up at night. He knows your hopes and your dreams and your prayers, but he doesn't simply know them. He wants to step into your home, the place that is personal to you. And he wants you to know that he doesn't just know your story, he understands it. Here's the truth. It's personal because Jesus understands your story. Since he can understand our stories, we can take steps in our lives to connect with him, connect with ourselves, and connect with others. So let's get real for a second. It can be really hard to let people into our lives and let people know where we live. For example, our house looks clean in this shot, but there's dishes in the sink, and for every shot I've had to do in this video, I've had to clean up a room because that's our lives. And often we don't want to let people in because we don't want people to judge us. It can be easy to hold on to those secrets because, again, we don't want people to judge us. No one likes to be judged. We think in our minds about all the responses that other people will have to our stories in our lives, and so we hold on tight to them. Sometimes we feel like our stories are even too big for us to handle, and so how can we expect someone else to get what we're going through? The beautiful thing is, when we can boldly share our stories with others, it gives them a sense of permission to share their stories with us. And so we need to find a place to start. Well, here are a few ideas. For some of you, the first step is going to be just wrestling with the idea and acknowledging that Jesus knows you, all the pieces of you, and wants to step into your story. It takes wrestling with the fact that he can understand your story, your situation, and your emotions, and that he loves you. Jesus knew Zacchaeus and all the rumors about his life and how he was an outcast from his community and how people hated him for his job and how he treated others. And because he knew that, he also knew that there was more to Zacchaeus' story than anyone knew. Jesus wants to step into your life, and he wants to get personal with you just as Zacchaeus did. For others, the next step in your journey is to let someone else into your story. I don't think it should be some random stranger, but someone you know already, someone you know that has your back, and someone you want to share your story with. And that's a huge step, and we get that. What if you knew that they already cared for you and they were there for you and they wanted to understand your story more? Why not start with your small group leader? You know, the adult that sits and listens to your stories each week and who shows up to see you. And hey, here's a secret, they have a backstory too. They understand a lot of what you're going through. Why not share a little bit more with your small group? It's a huge step, but what if you could give the gift of allowing someone else to go second while you're the first to share? Talk about your own backstory. Allow your group to see who you are when you're not with them. When you share your backstory, you're opening the door for someone else to have the freedom to also share their backstory. Allowing someone to see who you are behind closed doors can allow you to make connections with people that you might not have ever connected with before. And the thing that makes you feel different than anyone else could actually be the thing that connects you with someone else. Then, for others, it's time for you to really understand the story of other people. We have to create safe spaces in our lives to get to know others. We often act like the crowd towards Zacchaeus, and we see what's on the outside, we see their actions, and we pass judgment on other people because of it. But we have to get to know what's going on behind closed doors. Maybe it's how someone dresses or their reputation or how they have a different culture than you, or simply because you aren't sure what you both have in common. Take the next step to get personal with someone else and understand their story, to listen and to actually hear from them who they truly are. Our lives can change when we allow people to see who we are and to understand our stories, and even more when we can begin to understand the stories of others. Our lives can change when we allow people to see who we are and to understand our stories, and even more when we can begin to understand the stories of others. So just as Jesus took time to go into Zacchaeus' home to understand Zacchaeus' backstory, Jesus wants to be invited into your life too. Jesus wants to understand every part of who we are because our relationship with him is personal. So tonight, as we go into our small groups, what does it look like for you to have others understand your story? And what does it look like for you to understand theirs? We have this really unique opportunity to get personal, to really understand one another, and to see how it is that God is moving within our lives.